Ever had that gut-wrenching moment when you realize someone's been sneaky and messing with your stuff? Well, that's exactly how I felt when I found out Karen from the HOA had been plugging her shiny Tesla into my outdoor outlet, racking up an extra $300 on my electric bill every month. But don't click away just yet, because trust me, how I turned her $90,000 car into a useless brick of a battery is more satisfying than you can imagine. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're tuning in from. I have a feeling a lot of you are probably supposed to be working right now, but hey, your secret's safe with me. And don't worry, you won't regret sticking around for this story. Now, before we dive into this electrical disaster, let me set the stage. They say good fences make good neighbors, but sometimes no fence, no matter how good, can protect you from people who think the rules don't apply to them. Growing up in a hard-working, blue-collar neighborhood, I learned to respect other people's space and property. Apparently, that concept was lost on certain Tesla-driving suburbanites who preferred to wear designer sunglasses instead of paying their own bills. What followed wasn't just a tale of power theft, but a well-executed lesson in consequences. It's a lesson I'm still pretty proud of. As my grandfather always said, the best way to teach a thief isn't through law enforcement, but through an unexpected trap. Now, let's rewind. The trouble started when Deborah Harrington moved into the house next door, rolling up in her brand new, gleaming white Tesla Model X. I had no idea that car and its entitled driver would soon become the bane of my existence. I'm Ethan Bailey, a 35-year-old electrical engineer working remotely for a tech company in Seattle. Before making the jump to civilian life, I spent 6 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, specializing in power grid systems and security infrastructure. The military taught me precision, discipline, and problem solving, skills that would come in surprisingly handy when dealing with suburban warfare. For the last 3 years, I've lived in Pinewood Estates, a quiet neighborhood with a tight-knit HOA. It's the perfect place for a peaceful bachelor life. I bought the place after my divorce. Nothing dramatic, just two people realizing we wanted different things. I was enjoying my new routine, but that peace was shattered the moment Deborah moved in. Looking back, I should have known something was off when the previous homeowners practically fled the neighborhood, selling their house for way below market value. Now I realize they were probably just trying to escape before Deborah started her backyard infinity pool project. I first met Deborah when I delivered a welcome basket to her house, just some local craft beer, artisan chocolates, and a few neighborhood brochures. I'm not the most social guy, but I was raised with Midwestern manners, so I thought it was the right thing to do. Her response? A practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How thoughtful," she said, barely masking her disdain as she accepted my modest offering. Deborah was decked out in what I'd later recognize her signature outfit: yoga pants that had never seen a yoga studio, a cashmere sweater despite the heat, and enough jewelry to set off metal detectors. As she showed me around her newly renovated home, I couldn't help but notice how she repeatedly dropped words like premium, exclusive, and top of the line to describe every fixture and appliance. "This kitchen island, it's imported Italian marble," she said, running her perfectly manicured hand over the countertop, which was bigger than my entire kitchen. "We waited 6 months for it, but William, my husband, he's a corporate attorney, he said only the best for our forever home." She managed to mention her husband's high-status job about 3 more times during the 15-minute tour. When I mentioned I was an engineer, she barely hid her disinterest. Apparently, if you weren't a doctor, lawyer, or hedge fund manager, you didn't register on Deborah Harrington's social radar. In hindsight, that first interaction should have been my warning, but I ignored it, and soon Deborah's calculated community takeover began. She quickly befriended the HOA board with a mix of flattery, intimidation, and well-timed donations. Her lavish dinner parties became infamous, not for the conversation, but for the ridiculously expensive wine she served and the endless name-dropping. Within just 6 weeks of moving in, she'd somehow managed to nab the position of HOA vice president. The previous vice president, a sweet retired teacher named Dorothy, had stepped down, citing personal reasons. Little did we know those personal reasons were Deborah threatening to expose Dorothy's son's past DUI. Meanwhile, I kept my head down, focusing on work and the occasional video game session with friends. But I couldn't help noticing Deborah's swift rise to neighborhood power. As for the HOA, I had always thought of it as a special kind of hell, one I wasn't interested in. My philosophy was simple: pay my dues, follow the rules, and stay out of drama. But that all changed when I opened my elect. As I sat down, Deborah flashed me a smug smile from her seat at the board table. But then came the real shocker of the evening. Frank announced, "Next agenda item, approval for installation of community charging stations in the common areas." My ears perked up as Deborah stood, holding a glossy folder in front of her. "As we all know, green energy is the future," she began, clearly rehearsing. "I propose we install 4 Level 2 charging stations near the community center parking lot. This improvement will increase property values and show that Pinewood Estates is an environmentally conscious community." What she conveniently left out was that one of the proposed stations would be located just yards away from her house, in the common area next to my property. After the meeting, I stayed behind to review the proposal documents and discovered something that made my blood boil. The electricity costs for these charging stations would be billed to the HOA and distributed equally among all residents. In other words, Deborah had figured out a way to make the entire neighborhood pay for her Tesla charging habit. This wasn't just about one petty neighbor, it was a calculated scheme, and I was now in the middle of it. When I first laid eyes on the installation plans for the new outlets, a cold, uncomfortable reality struck me. This wasn't just between Deborah and me anymore. She had gone above and beyond, turning the entire neighborhood into her own personal energy source for her pricey Tesla. And the worst part? They didn't even realize they were getting scammed. I had to figure out what I was up against, so I dove headfirst into researching HOA regulations, local laws, and electrical codes. If I was going to stand up to Deborah, I needed to know the rules better than she did. Thankfully, my background in military engineering came in handy. I learned early on that in any battle, knowledge is just as important as firepower. After digging into the situation, I discovered something important. HOAs have a lot of control over the outside appearance of properties, but when it comes to utilities and safety, their authority has clear limits. Armed with this information, I started strategizing. During my research, I came across Martha Wilson, a 68-year-old widow who had lived in Pinewood Estates since the very beginning. Martha was sharp, not just with her eyes, but with her words. Over a cup of coffee in her cozy kitchen, she leaned in and said, "That Harrington woman, she's got half the board wrapped around her finger, like trained poodles." Martha had been keeping meticulous notes on HOA activities for years, and she had seen a lot. She showed me how previous board members were pressured to resign when they opposed Deborah's schemes. "Gregory's not a bad guy," she confided. "He's just weak. And Frank? Well, he's just counting the days until he can retire to Florida." Martha wasn't the only one watching the HOA. Through her, I met Brian and Sarah Thompson, a couple in their 40s, both hard-working parents with 2 young kids. Brian was a high school teacher, and Sarah worked as a nurse. They were struggling with the ever-increasing HOA fees and had serious concerns about the proposed charging stations. "We can barely keep up with the dues as it is," Sarah explained when I visited them one evening. "Another hike would mean cutting back on Tommy's baseball league." Their son, Tommy, was currently showing off security footage of Deborah's car stealing electricity, his little sister laughing at how much it looked like a villain in a movie. With Brian and Sarah's help, I started gathering evidence. I discreetly installed a power monitoring device on my electrical panel to track just how much electricity Deborah was using, an eye-popping 75 kilowatt hours each night. At our local rates, that was adding up to a significant amount of money over time. Brian and Sarah helped collect signatures from other homeowners who were also worried about rising HOA fees, and Martha provided crucial insights into the bylaws that could support our case.
By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, I had compiled a full dossier: video evidence, power consumption data, cost calculations, and signatures from 23 households opposing the charging station proposal without individual metering. I felt ready, confident even. But then, the night before the meeting, I got a call from Martha. "Ethan, the meeting's been postponed," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "They're claiming there's a technical issue with the clubhouse projector. But I just drove by and I saw Deborah's car parked at Frank's house. Something's going on." I stood there, thick folder in hand, as I watched Deborah whispering to board members the next day. That's when it hit me. Sometimes you can't win by playing by the rules of the game. Maybe it was time to make my own rules. The next morning, I made the decision to give Deborah one last shot at ending this peacefully. I've always believed in direct.
I designed it with industrial-grade materials, housed in a weatherproof case strong enough to withstand the Pacific Northwest's relentless rain. I even included a battery backup so the system would stay operational during power outages. This wasn't some cheap, makeshift solution. I was doing it the right way. After testing and finalizing the system, I installed it at the back of my property, where I knew Deborah had access to her favorite outlets. I mounted it in compliance with all electrical codes and even added a warning sign that lit up at night. Protected by SPS, authorized use only, unauthorized use may damage devices. I made sure no one could claim they hadn't seen it. I took photos to document the installation, ensuring everything was properly set up. I wasn't just covering my tracks, I was protecting myself legally. I reviewed the National Electrical Code guidelines twice and even asked a friend who was a city inspector to double-check everything. The system was designed to be non-invasive under normal use, only activating protective measures after multiple warnings were ignored. When that happened, it would simply create a controlled disruption, nothing that would damage property or harm anyone. But it would send a clear message: the electricity theft was over. The moment before disconnecting safely, I couldn't help but think, any damage would only happen if someone deliberately ignored the safety warnings. To cause harm to their own equipment, they'd have to put in some serious effort. I had tested the SPS one last time on a cool Tuesday evening, watching the diagnostic LEDs blink and sync, confirming everything was running smoothly. And in that moment, I wondered, did Deborah ever learn the one lesson every engineering student has drilled into them? That famous law of physics: for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. In the military, we had another saying that came to mind: play stupid games, win stupid prizes. And Deborah? Well, she was about to discover both of these lessons the hard way. The morning after I had installed my SPS, I watched through the kitchen window as Deborah did her usual walk around the property. She stopped right by the warning sign, squinting to read it. Then, without missing a beat, she dramatically rolled her eyes. Classic Deborah. That evening, I got another HOA violation notice. This time it was for unauthorized signage. But I knew better. Since the warning was a mandatory safety notification, in line with county regulations for electrical systems, there was no way they could remove it. I quickly submitted all the necessary documentation, quoting the relevant codes, and for once, Gregory had no leg to stand on. Over the next few days, I noticed Deborah eyeing the outlet on my property, but she wasn't using it. Was the warning effective after all? Martha, however, kept me in the loop about Deborah's latest neighborhood activities. "She's checking out the outlets by the clubhouse," Martha told me during her evening walk. "But they don't give enough power for fast charging, and she has to park too far from her house for it to be comfortable." I felt a little sense of triumph until I received a notification that the HOA board had approved emergency funding to upgrade the electrical infrastructure in the community's common areas. And get this, they bypassed the usual voting process, classifying it as an essential safety improvement. The next week, workmen showed up and installed high-capacity outlets in the exact spots Deborah had been eyeing, exactly as she had planned. But this time, it was fast-tracked as an emergency measure. That night, my security system went off, alerting me to movement.
I quickly checked the cameras and saw Deborah all smug plugging her Tesla into one of the new community outlets. With a little wave toward the camera, she strutted back to her house. I knew right away what was going on. The SPS immediately began recording data on the new power usage, confirming my suspicions. She was drawing a massive amount of power during off-peak hours, and the costs would be sped out across all residents. I expanded the SPS to monitor these new community outlets, not to control them since they weren't on my property, but to gather data on how they were being used. The results were eye-opening. Deborah was charging her car every single night between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., pulling maximum power for 3 straight hours. At current electricity rates, this was adding about $500 to the HOA's monthly bill. Meanwhile, I kept receiving petty violation notices. My mailbox was too low, my garage door needed repainting, even though I had just painted it a year ago, and my garbage cans were visible for 15 minutes too long on collection day. I kept my head down, carefully addressing each violation and documenting everything. As I continued to gather support from my neighbors, things started to shift. The Thompsons began showing my data to their trusted friends, and soon a network of concerned homeowners began to form. Then, through Martha's connections, I found out that Deborah was planning something even bigger. She was preparing a proposal for an official Tesla
Deborah muttered something about irrelevant blinking lights, but William continued to scan the documents. When I offered to show him the video of her ignoring the warnings, he held up his hand. That won't be necessary. Yet. Then I laid my cards on the table. William, your wife has been stealing electricity from me personally, and now from the community for months. I've got everything documented: videos, power consumption data, testimonies from other residents. I've tried to resolve this directly with both of you multiple times. William's lawyerly demeanor began to crack as he and Deborah exchanged glances. Additionally, I added, misuse of HOA funds for personal benefit could be considered fraud, especially when someone in a leadership position directs community resources for their own use. William's professional facade faltered. I see, he muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. Turning to Deborah, his tone shifted to one of concern. We need to talk at home, now. As they walked away, I overheard him mutter, 22,000? Are you kidding me? And you've been doing what with HOA funds? That afternoon, Deborah's beloved Tesla was hoisted onto a flatbed tow truck destined for the nearest service center. The initial diagnostic report came back with some bad news: a hefty $22,000 worth of damage to the battery management system. But what made matters worse for Deborah was that the damage wasn't covered under her warranty. It had been deemed the result of improper charging practices and blatant disregard for safety warnings. As the tow truck disappeared around the corner, Deborah shot me a venomous look. You haven't won yet, Ethan, she spat. The HOA will stand with me on this. I grinned, unfazed. Actually, Deborah, I think we need to meet at the special HOA meeting I've just called. I think everyone will be really interested in seeing these videos and finding out who they've been paying to charge their car for all these months. Fast forward to the following week, an HOA meeting like no other. The clubhouse was packed. Nearly every household in the neighborhood was represented. Neighbors who normally exchanged nothing more than a nod or a quick wave now gathered in tight groups, whispering nervously. I arrived 15 minutes early to set up my presentation, but Martha, always ahead of the game, was already there, calmly organizing a stack of papers. She shot me a wink and slid a copy of her work my way. It was a complete and detailed record of every HOA financial decision made in the past 6 months, with annotations highlighting which bylaws had been violated. Martha had clearly been preparing for this moment long before I even thought to call the meeting. Frank, the HOA president, was a nervous wreck. His hands trembled as he adjusted his glasses, his usual confidence crumbling as he realized Martha was handing out her well-prepared documents. He hadn't expected such a fierce fight. Deborah, meanwhile, sat in the front row, her designer outfit screaming wealth, her arms crossed defiantly. Her expression was thunderous. William was noticeably absent. Tokyo needed him again, apparently.
"We have a special presentation tonight," Frank managed to stammer, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. "Ethan Bailey has requested time to address a community concern." The room went silent as I made my way to the front, laptop in hand. I was calm, prepared. This was no different from a military briefing, except the stakes were personal this time. As I connected my laptop to the projector, I caught a glimpse of Brian and Sarah Thompson giving me thumbs up from the back. Their kids were content with their coloring books, perfectly happy to wait for what promised to be a long and perhaps controversial discussion. I'd asked Brian earlier if the meeting was appropriate for the kids, and his response had been simple. They need to see that standing up to bullies works. That's why I liked the Thompsons. With everything in place, I dove into the presentation, showing security footage of Deborah stealing electricity, power consumption data, and the detailed cost breakdown. For the past 6 months, the Harrington household had been pulling about 75 kilowatts of electricity every night from community sources, adding around $500 a month to our collective HOA bill. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as I displayed a graph that clearly showed HOA fees spiking at the exact same time Deborah's charging habits ramped up. I continued, explaining how recent emergency electrical upgrades had been rushed through without proper voting, upgrades designed specifically to support this ongoing abuse of community resources. I then introduced the SPS, the industrial-grade protection system I had installed. It had the proper certifications, and it issued loud, clear warnings when unauthorized usage was detected before taking protective action. Unfortunately, these warnings were ignored, leading to the damage we were now dealing with. I played the video, showing Deborah not only disregarding the warning lights, but actively.
Every time I drive past the spot where Deborah used to park her Tesla, I can't help but smile. That spot now has an official charging station, complete with its own meter and a transparent payment system. It's almost poetic. Deborah could have had everything she wanted, if only she had played fair. But her greed ended up costing her $22,000 in repairs, $7,000 in restitution, and a hasty below-market sale of her home. Sometimes those who wield power and privilege forget one important lesson. Not everyone is a helpless victim. I'm an electrical engineer with experience in protection systems, and I'd say I was probably the most expensive lesson Deborah ever learned. There's a certain kind of poetry in it. Deborah came into our community like a whirlwind, breaking rules and disrupting lives. But in the end, she was undone by the very electricity she tried to steal. As Martha wisely put it during one of our coffee chats, her eyes twinkling, life has a funny way of balancing things out, doesn't it? Over her reading glasses, she smirks. You know what they say, karma doesn't need Wi-Fi to find the right people, and trust me, it's working its magic right now. I couldn't agree more. Sometimes justice comes through formal channels, and other times it shows up in the most unexpected, well-crafted packages, complete with flashing warning signs that, let's face it, some people should really be paying attention to. The best part? Our community is stronger than ever. People are connecting more, having each other's backs, and the new leadership is all about transparency. It's like a breath of fresh air after what felt like years of secrecy and broken trust. Sure, no place is perfect, no neighborhood is, but one thing we've learned is that standing up to bullies, no matter how old you are, really does make a difference. And if there's anything I've taken away from this wild ride, it's this. While electrical engineering skills might not win you any party invitations, they sure come in handy when it's time to show someone the true cost of messing with the wrong people. Thanks for tuning in.